Hello, this is Dr. Phil Rosenkrantz from the Industrial and Manufacturing Engineering Department at Cal Poly Pomona, and this is my attempt to explain the idea of collective bargaining. That is, what are unions? What's this labor and management thing um, that some of you may not know much about? I'm making this presentation because in my 20 or so years of teaching the engineering ethics course under whatever name we were using at the time, I found that students didn't know much about uh, this thing called collective bargaining, the labor management relationship, and they were curious about it. And so this is a talk that I've given numerous times over the years, but not in front of the camera till now. So I'm going to try and do it a little bit of justice. I don't have a fancy PowerPoint here, but hopefully you will find this useful in understanding what's going on in this field. And my basis for this is my entire working career, including college, uh, starting in right out of high school uh, as a co-op student up until now, I have always worked in an organization that had a union. When I was at General Motors for 15 years, the union we had was the United Auto Workers. And in the history of unions, United Auto Workers stands about as tall as any of them in terms of um, their influence in collective bargaining and their power, so to speak, in the labor movement. And then I've also worked for the last 38 years uh, in the California State University system. And in my first year, we started being represented by the California Faculty Association, which is a union that was invented for the faculty of the California State University. Um, so I've been in two different kinds of environments. Let me add that at the Cal State University system, the staff is represented by a union, CSEA. There are other unions on campus, and in fact, at the Cal Poly Pomona campus, recently, within the last, I'm guessing 5 years, that's a rough estimate, the students were organized by the United Auto Workers, and so they're now represented by that union. So with that, let me try and explain a little bit, and let me also point out that back in the 60s or so, 60s roughly, uh, about half of all workers in the United States were represented by a labor union. So labor unions and their overall organizations, AFL-CIO, etc., were very powerful. They represented a lot of people. But over the years, due to a number of reasons, and I'm not really going to go into that too much, but over the years, the number of people represented by unions has dropped, and now it's down to, well, the last I heard it was 14% of labor, and I believe it's less than that now. So many of you may never see a union, but some of you are going to be impacted one way or another. And I think, for example, if you're a civil engineer, you're going to be working with construction unions almost everywhere you go. If you're involved with government, most government workers are covered by unions. So it just depends on where you're going. And another thing you're going to run into is that the power or the influence of unions also varies a lot from state to state because some states have made laws that favor unions and some states have made laws that favor uh, companies that don't want to have unions. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. I made a list here of the topics that I hope to cover. And so some of it is just terminology, but also some of it's history. And then I'm going to finish up with a couple of experiences that I hope will help you. First of all, let me define some of these things I've already been saying. When we say the word labor, we're referring to workers, and we're also often referring to unions. These are the people doing the work. The people on the assembly line at the auto industry, in the auto plants, the people that are doing the mining inside of a mine, the workers themselves. Blue collar is sometimes what they're called. And management then represents supervision all the way up to the top. And that's sometimes it's called white collar workers, but white collar can also just refer to somebody that's a clerk, and a lot of times they're represented by unions as well. So labor and management are the two words that are often used. And so what are we kind of dealing with here is if we have management and we have labor, where does the union come into this? Well, for many years, workers were not represented by anybody. They were just working in the coal mines or building the railroad or whatever it was. And they could be treated well or they could be mistreated by the owners of the company and by management. And labor was hard. People didn't have paid vacations, they didn't have insurance. If they got injured, they weren't covered by the company's any kind of a medical plan. And it was really tough. And a lot of management and a lot of owners were real hard drivers. And there was no love lost between labor and management. So finally, labor decided to start organizing. And so they came up with what we now call a union. But in the beginning, the union didn't really have any legal kind of backing or standing. They would organize labor, they would get support, and then they would go to management and say, look, we represent your workers, and here's our demands. And management could choose to do whatever they want with that. But unions started getting some recognition. But the problem was that because there was no legal status here, that you could have strikes, things turned to violence. It was pretty bad. The auto industry was kind of notorious for that. And although I'm not going to go into that too much. So in 1935, we have the National Labor Relations Act, which came up with a legal status for unions on things like how they could organize, what management's rights were in terms of any of that, how they could negotiate, what was a legal strike versus not a legal strike. And so it established a set of ground rules that management and labor had to follow. And part of that was in establishing what we call collective bargaining. And a collective bargaining agreement is where, with the union representing labor, they would meet with management and negotiate a contract. And this was the collective bargain agreement. And so they would go through this thing called collective bargaining. Now let me say something about collective bargaining. First of all, it is not a rational process. It is horse trading, if you will. Management has a list of things they're willing to give up. The union has a list of demands. They go into a room and they negotiate. And they try to hammer something out. But there's a lot of trade-offs. And if they can come to an agreement, they settle with a collective bargaining agreement. They write it up and they all sign it. And then this is their agreement that they're going to operate with for a given period of time. Typical would be 3 years. And this lists all kinds of things like how the union can file grievances. Management has in there, they've negotiated what the disciplinary procedure is for workers that aren't considered to be doing their job, and how much work people can do, and then also things like seniority rights and any rights that the union has to have to approve plans that management has for things. And so anyway, this agreement then is signed, and then this is what they operate under. And included in there are things like, what about if the company isn't operating under what's considered the agreement or the spirit of the agreement, or bargaining in bad faith and stuff like that. So there's a lot in here, and there's typically an agreement for the whole organization, like General Motors would negotiate with the UAW, United Auto Workers, and come up with an overall agreement for the whole General Motors Corporation, but then each local facility would negotiate with their local chapter of the union on their agreements. And that could get kind of gnarly. Then part of this was, what are the rules for a union striking? Now, what's a strike? A strike is where the workers, because they're dissatisfied with something, either the negotiations aren't going well, or something has happened to create an unsafe condition or unsavory condition, and the union decides they're not going to work, and they're going to form a line outside the plant. Usually it's called a picket line. They carry signs, they protest, and they quit working. Now, sometimes those strikes are legitimate, and sometimes, though, they're not. And when they're not legitimate, they're called wildcat strikes. And in that case, management oftentimes will then hire other people to come in and work, or they'll take people out of their offices to go to work. And those people that cross the picket line to go into work have a very unsavory name called a scab, in case you ever hear that. So this is kind of what's going on. And I mentioned that some states have laws and rules. Well, there are a couple of terms here: closed versus open shop. Sometimes you have a union in a company and they represent the workers, but they only represent the workers that join the union and pay the union dues. Even though they're negotiating a contract for all workers, they basically have to woo people into joining them by trying to convince them that it's a good deal. Some states have laws that allow unions to have a closed shop, where if the union is voted in, they automatically represent everybody, whether or not somebody wants to be in a union or not. Because there are some people that don't want to be in a union. They may even have religious reasons for not being in a union. And so being forced to be in a union is very difficult for them. And so you have some states that are called right to work states, where somebody does not have to be forced into a union. And those states typically, because they have less union representation, they have typically lower wages, and so a lot of companies like to work in those states because they can have lower wages to pay. But I'm not making a political comment here. I'm just trying to explain the difference. And I know what happened in California, in the California State University system. The CFA, California Faculty Association, it was an open shop, and so a faculty member did not have to join the union. Well, the union got a bill passed and signed by the governor of California saying that since all the faculty were being represented by the union agreements that the CFA was negotiating, that even if you weren't a member of the union, you had to pay an association fee, which was a percentage of the union dues, and it was based on some estimate. The idea being that the other part of the union dues you weren't paying was what was used for political reasons, which you may not want to support. So that's what happened in California. Anyway, that's just a little bit. Now, let me talk a little bit about union and management, labor and management, and this is my perspective. And I've been studying leadership for most of my working career, starting with my master's degree in industrial administration all the way through my doctorate in organizational leadership. And I believe that a lot of the problems that have been caused were because of poor management. On the other hand, a lot of problems are caused because some union representatives are really power happy, and sometimes, not all, I'm just saying some, and sometimes they're using labor to further their own ends. Again, that's just sometimes. But anyway, the problem that the union has is that, in my opinion, is sometimes in the negotiating, what they will do is they will trade off legitimate grievances from the workers. They will trade them away to get some things they want from management, and the workers that had legitimate grievances feel jaded, and so that happens. On the other hand, if management was treating their workers right, not only would they make more money, but then the workers would be less inclined to feel like they needed union representation. So that's just kind of those are just side comments from me. And some people could totally disagree with me. But I'm basing what I'm saying on 50 years of working around unions and working in leadership and management. Okay, so let me talk about, I have on here, it says Fremont, Nummi, Tesla. So what's going on there? General Motors had an assembly division, General Motors Assembly Division, and they built cars and trucks. And there were other automobile assembly plants within General Motors, but this was the largest division making vehicles. And I worked at the General Motors Assembly Division plant in Southgate for 15 years, 5 years while going to school as a co-op student, and 10 years as an industrial engineer. There was also a General Motors Assembly Division plant in Fremont, California. And that plant throughout the corporation was one of the worst plants in terms of management, labor relations. They had their union consisted of a lot of actual communists, very militant, at the Fremont plant. But they also had one of the worst management organizations in the corporation. Now, how did that happen? The Fremont plant was one of the last assembly division plants built. I think it was in the early 60s. And what happened was General Motors assembly division plants from all over the country, there were about 18 or 17 of them, sent their worst management to the Fremont plant to get rid of them. They would say, oh, you'd really be good at that new plant. They would tout these people as being good. And so the Fremont plant filled up with the dregs from all over the division. And that plant never could get their feet on the ground management-wise, and relationships with the union didn't get good ever. And so in 1982, when General Motors downsized, they closed 3 plants. The Southgate plant that I was at, because of environmental reasons, cost. They closed the Lakewood plant, which was in Atlanta, Georgia. It was just an old factory, very difficult to be efficient. But they closed the Fremont plant because they just could never get that one working right. My story continues. A couple of years after that, General Motors has a partnership with Toyota to build Toyotas and Geos in that plant. And it was run by Toyota. And so what they did was they decided that if you had ever worked in management at the Fremont plant, they would not hire you. But to satisfy the union, they said they would hire hourly people, the workers, back. And so the same workers that were in this terrible Fremont plant were now workers in this Japanese plant. And that included the same communists and all that. Well, Toyota would take people over to Japan, let them work in Japanese plants, learn what their system was, the Toyota method, Toyota production system, and a lot of those people caught on to it and converted to it. And the Nummi plant in Fremont became one of the most efficient, most profitable automobile plants in the world under different management. Well, that went for a long time, but then General Motors decided to pull out of it for some reason. And so that left Toyota with only their stuff, and they said, well, we don't really need this plant anymore because we could take our production and we could move it to another plant somewhere else in the country. So they closed down Nummi. Well, guess who is using that plant now? Well, that's where Tesla is. And they're building cars under a whole different, management system. And I got to admit, I don't know, I'm not real familiar with it, other than Elon Musk is a different, he's different than any of these others were. But that's not what I'm talking about here. But my point being that management has a lot to do with what's going on with labor and unions, in my opinion. Now, in organizing a union, there are rules that have to be followed. But basically, if there is a non-union organization somewhere, anybody that wants to organize a union has the right to talk to those people. And they can't be denied that right by management. And so that's kind of a bone of contention. Management would like to go down and tell their workers, look, if you vote no on the union, this is what I'll do for you. And they can't do stuff like that. Even though it happens, I'm sure. But anyway, there's organizing rules. And if you don't understand those organizing rules, you can get yourself in a world of trouble if you're saying and doing things to try and keep a union from talking to workers. Now, also, I wanted to give you a couple of personal experiences. First of all, I want to talk about there was an overwork grievance that workers could file. Now, there was a grievance procedure, and if a worker felt that they were being overworked, they could file a grievance. When that happened, what the labor agreement said was that the Industrial Engineering Department would go out and do a time study to find out how many minutes per hour the person was actually working, and that information would be shared with management and the union, and then the Labor Relations Department and the union at the plant would negotiate on what they would do with that job. Would they take some work off of it, or would they do nothing? And so this meant that once that grievance was filed, you now had to take 4 to 8 hours of an industrial engineer's time to do a time study, and then all kinds of negotiating went on, and it could take months to negotiate and settle that. You also had disgruntled employees, if they were overworked, that were suffering during that period of time while that was going on. I learned from a very wise industrial engineer one time kind of a different approach. And so when I was asked to do a time study because of an overwork grievance, what I do is I would go out and I'd watch the job, and I could tell within a short period of time whether or not that job was really overworked or not. If it was not overworked, then I would do a time study, and the time study involves making a complete exhaustive list of everything that person did, figuring out what the standard time was for those. And what's the standard time? The standard time is how much time it would take a normal average person to do that work. So if you were a fast worker, you could beat the time. If you just happened to be slow, then you were working pretty hard. But it was based on what an average typical person could do. And then you would multiply out the times by what percentage of cars it applied to and come up with a composite time in minutes per hour. And typically anything between 48 and 52 or 54 minutes was considered a reasonable workload. But people have different opinions. What I would do is go out, and if I could tell that that job was overworked, that I believed that it was overworked, and would end up being 56, 58, 59 minutes per hour of work, if I perceived that, I would go to the supervisor and say, look, I'm out here to do a time study, but we probably both know that job is overworked. Can we do something to fix it? And just do it now, without the negotiating going on, without me doing a time study. And a lot of times there's things we could do. We could move something from one place to another. A lot of times I could just say, let's give the person an apron. They could put their parts in the apron, and it saves them walking back and forth to the workbench. Or let's put in something that will move the material closer to where they are. Let's put a balancer to hang their gun close, their air power tool close to them so they don't have to go get it. And by doing simple things like that, we could take 2, 3, 4 minutes off of a job and make it easier to do. Or maybe we could get them something to sit on, whatever. And, after doing that, the person may or may not remove the grievance, but I think we were doing the right thing. And most of the time, the grievance was withdrawn. And if it wasn't withdrawn, it was usually because there was a grudge between the worker and the supervisor and they're just trying to get even. But if somebody feels like somebody came out and took care of them, it puts a better taste in their mouth. And it saved a lot of people some work. So that's what I used to do. But let me tell you another story. And it was when I was the industrial engineer for what was the soft trim department. The soft trim department made the seats. And then the seats were put on a conveyor and sent up to the final line where they were installed in the car. So front and rear seats. And the shop steward, who was in charge of that area, I don't know if I put that up there, the shop steward, the union representative for that area, was a short guy, and his name was Robbie, and he looked like a bulldog. He had a face that could have been used for a caricature of a bulldog. And I remember when I was a student, I was afraid of Robbie because he would walk down the aisle, the main aisle, had his union agreement in his hand, mean look on his face. And one time when I was walking toward him, he could sense fear, and so he said, "Boo!" and I jumped. And I would see him coming, I'd go into a department and walk around him. So guess what happened? I'm the industrial engineer for the soft trim department, and guess who the shop steward is? It's Robbie. Well, by then I was a little more mature and not quite as afraid, but I was a little unhappy to work with him. But let me tell you what happened. There was a grievance filed, and the reason it was filed was because the worker was mad at his supervisor. So he just filed a grievance. So I did the time study on it, and my time studies, I always was as thorough as possible. I put everything down, checked all my math. If I said there was so many minutes of work, that was the average. And I didn't care what it was. If it turned out to be high, it was high. If it was low, it was low. And I didn't fudge. So this came out to be about 47 or 48 minutes, which was a good job. And so I remember I walked out to the soft trim department, and Robbie was standing there with his copy of the time study. The worker was standing there working that had filed it. Sometimes the person that filed the grievance was on a different shift, but the person that filed the grievance was there working. And Robbie was flipping through the pages, and he, I don't know if he saw me standing there or not. I don't think he did. But he turned to the worker and he said, "Why did you file this grievance? You're not overworked." And the worker said, "Yes, I am. I'm working too hard. I'm working too much." Robbie could tell from my numbers, and he could tell from watching the guy he wasn't overworked. So he said, "Well, this shows that you're not overworked." And the worker said, "Well, that's wrong then." And this is what blew me away. Robbie took this time study and said, "No, it's right. And I know it's right because Rosencrantz did it." And he threw it at the worker and walked away. And I'd never seen anything like that before. Fast forward, I don't know, a couple months. I'm in the industrial engineering department. I'm sitting at my desk, And hourly workers typically weren't allowed in the industrial engineering department. I guess they thought we had, management thought we had some kind of secret data or something. I don't think we had anything that was really helpful. I mean, we had labor information, but I don't think there's anything that was unknown. But anyway, Robbie, in his coveralls, he walked into the industrial engineering office. He pulled up a chair next to me at my desk. He sat down and he said, Phil, he said, there's a worker out there at a workstation and I think he could use some help. Do you think you could look at it for me and see if we could help him? And I said, sure, Robbie, I'll do that, no problem. He said, thank you. And he got up and left. Well, the superintendent of industrial engineering was sitting in his office looking through the glass, and he was mortified that a union worker had walked into the office. He complained about it, and then the plant manager complained to the union about it. And Robbie, from then on, he really had it out for my superintendent, and he just ridiculed him and harassed him for forever. But I think that's the way things should work. You don't have to have everything to be divisive. You work together and solve problems. So anyway, back to the union agreement though. Let me say that if you are working somewhere that has a collective bargaining agreement, the best, if you're in management, if you're an engineer, whatever, the best way to work is to try to follow the agreement as close as you can. Don't try to cut corners. Don't try to go against the spirit of it. That is what management negotiated with the union. This is what they both said they agreed to. So the best thing you can do is try to follow it, whether you agree with it or not. And that, I think, is the path of least resistance, as well as doing everything you can. If you see what you perceive to be as overwork or unsafe, you deal with it as fast as you can. You don't wait for agreements to be submitted. So that's my advice. What about engineers, for example, or professionals being members of a union? There are places where there are unions that professionals are members of. The National Association of Society of Professional Engineers does not believe that engineers should be members of a union. And there are multiple reasons, but the primary reason is that an engineer has a higher standard of safety, and that's one of our major charges, is to hold paramount the safety of workers and public. And so the idea that a union is going to be negotiating those away or influencing those seems to be an ethical decision-making conflict for engineers. So that's the stand they take. Now, I'm not going to take a position on this, but professionals a lot of times don't like being represented by non-professional unions. For example, if you're a pharmacist working in a grocery store chain that has pharmacies, your union that's representing you is the retail clerks union. And so you may not feel that they're negotiating in the best interest of the public because of what they have to do in the pharmacy. So I'm just giving that as an example. So I don't know how long I've talked. Only I hope that this is helpful, and I apologize for it being long. I know people today only like 5 and 10 minute long videos, so I'm sorry. But I notice over here, I want to point something out. It doesn't have anything to do with my presentation, but this is my recently published book, Letters from Uncle Dave, The 73-Year Journey to Find a Missing in Action World War II Paratrooper. It's available on Amazon. And so anyway, if you like a good story, an interesting story, if you're interested in history, if you're interested in World War II, interested in paratroopers, um, grab the book and leave a review on Amazon. So anyway, with that, I'm going to stop, and I hope you have a good day.